All right, Mark Littlewood, Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Nicky.
Hi, Jonathan Davis, Economist and Wealth Manager. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Nicky.
Hi. And Mark Littlewood, has this bank bashing gone too far?
Yes, I think it is. I can completely understand why even some years later people are still furious. If you run a bank like RBS, it goes bust and the chief executive walks away with a taxpayer-funded pension of £750,000 a year for the rest of his life, well, it's pretty easy to understand why people get angry. But my real problem with it isn't whether we're bashing banks or praising banks, it's what's the policy framework. And I think George Osborne's got this badly wrong. We seem to be going down a route of trying to make sure that every retail bank is safe. And I actually think that's looking at the problem the wrong way. What we need to make sure is not that banks are safe, it's that bank failure is safe. And what we're trying to do here with all of these sort of weird and wonderful terms like electrified ring fences, which doesn't actually sound to me like it makes anything safer at all, an electrified ring fence, is to give the impression that in the future sort of no retail bank will go to the wall again. We, the state, and we, the regulators, will make sure that good practice is adopted and that there's never a Northern Rock situation. Well, it's worth remembering, of course, that Northern Rock was a retail bank. It went bust because it was offering extremely stupid retail mortgages. So I think that we're in danger of perpetuating a myth that retail banking can be made copper-bottomed and safe. Investment banking is a bunch of wide boys who are basically gambling in the casino. And if we can effectively split the two, we can avoid any bank failure ever again in future. And what we need to make sure is that banks can fail. It's just that we need to make sure they don't bring down the entirety of Western capitalism when they do.
Jonathan Davis.
I would like to nominate Mark Littlewood for Chancellor of the Exchequer for what he just said there. I would like to add to it that not only must we allow banks which lend recklessly and lose vast amounts of money to go bust, but we've also got to realise that the politicians and the bankers are in cahoots with each other. By the way, you missed out Tony Blair from that list of people who were supporting the banks. He's just made about 20 or 30 million pound from working with the banks. We note that they're going to potentially split High Street from investment banking. First of all, in any case, they're not going to do it till 2019. And, they talk about we're going to make big changes. We're going to make the banking system work for us as opposed to we're working for them. Well, I'd like to ask, with all the fraud and corruption in banking, LIBOR manipulation, drug money laundering in Mexico by HSBC, all proven, all open, why do we not have a single prosecution of bankers?
Mark Littlewood.
Well, fraud should be prosecuted, there's no doubt about it. And, I don't think we can hang out every banker to dry if you find that, some drugs money has turned up in some bank. It was a massive bank. Oh, it is, but if you want banks to be regulated such that every single in and out transaction they have to give an absolute copper-bottomed guarantee that the person making that transaction has, for example, absolutely nothing to do with the drugs industry. No, you're not going to have very many successful banks at all. Yes, there should be, I think, light touch but harsh regulation. If a banker is done for fraud or rigging something, that should be a criminal offence. But what we're creating is just a regulated industry in which virtually every single action is regulated. The Financial Services Authority, the group that has regulated the banks to date, has about 1.5 million paragraphs of regulations in its guidebook. The idea that this is a light-touch, deregulated industry is madness. And the idea if we only had 1.6 million paragraphs of regulation rather than 1.5 million paragraphs, suddenly things would be a lot safer.
Jonathan Davis, I heard you disputing something halfway through that.
Absolutely. First of all, the suggestion that the money laundering in Mexico by HSBC was incidental is absolute nonsense, and Littlewood knows that. They set up a bank 99% owned by HSBC in order to do this. It was approved by the highest echelons of HSBC. But moving on to the regulation...
Is there institutional corruption?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. It's proven beyond belief. Look at the LIBOR investigation. Everybody knows it. There's no question about that. But let's move on to the regulation. You're absolutely correct. A million lines of regulation. Do you know what? We have no regulation in this country. If we did, the banks would not have been lending 125% mortgages. They would not have been lending structured products to businesses that made the banks fortunes and put businesses out of business, and so on and so on. There is basically no regulation in this country, whether it's in retail banking or in investment banking. That is one of the reasons actually why we do need to split high street from investment banking, because then the high street will not be the reason why these chancellors say we have to bail out the banks. The depositors will be looked after separately. The investment banking actually has little to do with banking these days. It's all about weird and wonderful financial instruments. Banking is about deposit taking and lending. So why on earth is it that city institutions, which are basically traders, why can they own deposit institutions? It's an absolute nonsense.
Let's hear from Stuart in Yeovil and Pat in Wiltshire. Brief points, please. 0500 909 693 on bank on 590. Oh, hang on a minute. 0500 909 693. Get my numbers muddled up. Stuart, not good when you're talking about banking. Hello, Stuart. What's your point? Anthony Brown, Chief Executive of the British Bankers Association, Stuart, said the legislation will create uncertainty for investors, making it more difficult for banks to raise capital, which will ultimately mean banks will have less money to lend to businesses. Stuart.
Well, I mean, I'm cynical at the best of times regarding banking, but I mean, that gentleman you just mentioned or quoted there is talking absolute nonsense, not for the first time. The only uncertainty that it will create is within the banking sector, where their next ridiculous loan or their next ridiculous sort of investment can come from, supported by the taxpayer. There is absolutely no doubt. Why have we had to wait 5 years, Nicky, to even suggest that we're going to in the banks with meaningful legislation? This should have happened a decade ago. And as a gentleman before me alluded to, I've got a serviceable brain between my ears, Nicky. When I saw the Northern Rock, et al. And all the other loan sharks that they were lending 125% mortgages, as a fairly intelligent man, that set off enormous alarm bells in my mind. And nobody did anything about it. I think this is politically expedient at this moment in time.
Fair play to Andy Verity. You were politically expedient at this moment in time. Let me bring Andy in, because you make a very good point about
spot on, Andy Verity.
Oh, thank you. But
you were going on about this.
Well, I mean, how do you react though to people who would say, well, Lehman Brothers wasn't a retail bank, and that was actually the thing that really triggered the crisis, and it was them letting it go under that really triggered the crisis. And that I mean, some people say actually it's the interconnectedness. This is what Alistair Darling says: the interconnectedness of all the banks that meant that you couldn't let them go under.
Nicky,
okay, let's bring you back in. Jonathan Davis, go on.
Andy, letting Lehman Brothers go under was exactly what we need as it happens. It did not trigger the crisis. The crisis was triggered years before, when the banks were allowed to lend whatever they wanted to lend. And to suggest, as people are doing, that if we don't bring these banks to heel, then it's going to cost us money. Well, let me remind you, we've given the banks £1,000 billion. The longer we continue to bail these banks out to the tune of 100 or so billion pounds a year, the longer we will stay in economic malaise.